Welcome, everyone. I'm Ashanti Edwards, the Director for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer Online with LSC as part of the ASCB Professional Development webinar series. Today, our facilitator, Dr. Erin Dolan, will be introducing our panelists. Erin?
It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Online with LSE. This is a webinar series that's initially intended to give people behind the scenes insights into how education research gets done. But what I really like about this series is also bringing together a community of folks who are paying attention to evidence and thinking about how to help each other be effective teachers, help our students learn, be effective mentors. And so today we're going to focus on a topic that's very timely for all of us, troubleshooting online instruction. And it's my privilege to welcome 5 panelists who are here with us today: Bouwma, Becca Price, Jim Hewlett, TJ Holmberg, and Erika Offerdahl. And I'm gonna ask each of them to just briefly introduce themselves before we get started with the questions. And what I'm gonna ask you all to do is to look for the Q&A function. So if you scroll over your screen, what should pop up at the bottom is something that says Q&A. We'll start with a couple of questions that we thought would come up from the group, but I encourage you to go ahead and start posting the questions that you have about troubleshooting online instruction in the Q&A, and then we will address them as we go through the session. If you have ideas that you'd like to share, please feel free to type those in the chat as well, and we'll save both the Q&A and the chat for distribution on the ASCD website after the fact. So Andy, would you be willing to start us off, please?
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Bouwma. I'm a senior instructor at Oregon State University, and I've been teaching both on campus and online. I've been teaching introductory biology online for the past 5 years.
Thanks. Jim?
Hi, everybody. Jim Hewlett, professor of biology at Finger Lakes Community College. I've been teaching online for a little over 20 years now. Currently, I'm teaching Human Anatomy and Physiology, Part 1 and 2 online this semester.
Thanks. TJ?
Hi, I'm TJ Holmberg. I teach at Northwestern Connecticut Community College. I've been teaching online for 18 years, including earth science, environmental science, and I teach a wide variety of hybrids as well, including intro bio, ecology, and botany.
Thanks. Erika?
Good morning, everyone. I'm an associate professor at Washington State University. I teach upper division biochemistry. I've designed and taught online courses for the National Teachers Enhancement Network, and I support faculty in designing assessments.
And last but not least, Becca.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everybody. It's great to have you with us. I am a professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences, and I have extensive experience teaching hybrid courses, although this is the first quarter that I'm teaching entirely online. Now, part of what I do is a lot of professional development around teaching, so I've kept up with the teaching online literature. And one of the things that I've found is that the best practices in online instruction have really changed and improved the way my in-person classes go.
That's a great message, and hopefully we'll come back to that, because I'm also thinking, as I teach online for the first time, I should have done this when I was teaching in person. This is such a good idea. But what I'd like to do is start with something that I think we're all dealing with now, which is things not going as anticipated. So what I'd like y'all to do is think of a time that something went wrong when you taught, perhaps early on in your online teaching experience, and how did you deal with it? Andy, would you be willing to start us off?
Yeah, so when I first taught intro biology online, I think the thing that became apparent to me right away was that I had overplanned my assignments and made them too complex. And there was a lot of confusion from students because my assignments were multi-step, and they had different due dates for each step. And they just, I mean, all of us have experienced giving students instructions in class and been frustrated, I'm sure, when they don't don't seem able to pick up multi-step instructions in class, and the same is true online. And so I found that I had to, if I was going to have multi-step assignments with different due dates, that I had to have a rhythm for the course so that I would have the same due dates each week. So I'd have things due Wednesday at midnight, I'd have things due Sunday at midnight every week. And so if there was a multi-step assignment, the first part would be due Wednesday, the second part would be due Sunday. And that helped reduce some confusion. The other thing that I did was I quickly enacted a discussion board for question and answers that I encouraged students to post their question and answers to the whole class. And they were encouraged to answer each other's questions as well, so I wouldn't get the same questions sent to me over and over again. And then related to that, I also set up a frequently asked questions page in Canvas that was linked from the top of the Q&A board. And those steps that I took early on in my first online course dramatically reduced the amount of emails to me from students, and I think it really reduced student confusion.
TJ, how about you? What went wrong and how did you deal with it?
So I've been through a lot of iterations of LMS from the early days of when they first started, where they were very different than today. But I would say organization. So kind of piggybacking off of what Andrew was saying, making sure that the course isn't too chock full of stuff. So they know where to go, things are clearly labeled and labeled as what they are. So if you have homework in a certain folder, that it's labeled homework. So they know where to go and where to find things. I found early on that maybe I was putting different pieces in different folders or trying to chunk information like I would in an on-ground class. And students were having trouble finding things. And so making things as easily accessible as possible and as intuitive as possible, kind of using best practices for how websites are designed. And especially as LMS systems have evolved over time, it's become easier to do that, I would say, to kind of build them almost like you would build a website. And so using the menus, using the folder and file structures to be as clear and concise for students as you can.
Becca, you're moving to this entirely online pretty recently. So how about you?
Yeah, this is the first week of the quarter, and we definitely had some hiccups. With the hybrid courses I've taught, the online portion has been asynchronous, and there's been a lot of talk about right now whether instruction should be synchronous or asynchronous. And what we decided to do this quarter was to have synchronous class meetings, but have them recorded so that students who can attend, who need to attend asynchronously, have all the material available to them. And what this means is that preparing the materials for the asynchronous students is happening while the synchronous class is going on. So it's actually a way to, since my mentees are teaching the class and they're in this program to learn how to use active learning techniques, we didn't want to lose that. And we wanted to make sure that was implemented into their instruction. And that can only happen with synchronous work. So we're trying to live in the best of both worlds. But what that means is that I'm new to using Zoom breakout rooms. And those are not intuitive. And we have 4 instructors in the course. So not all of the instructors can float across the different breakout rooms. And when you make an announcement, you can't vocally make an announcement for all of the breakout rooms to hear. And so if students are working on a document, they don't see the text message flash by that is the announcement from the instructor. So we've had lots of hiccups with how to use the breakout rooms and encourage conversation among students during our synchronous meetings.
Jim, how about you?
Yeah, so I actually do go way back as well to a platform called Lotus Notes was the first actual online class that, if you remember that, that shows how old I am, I guess. But one of the things that went wrong early that I realized was I assumed that if I could navigate my course, and if I could navigate an educational product like an online lab component, that all my students would be able to navigate it as well. And so that turns out not to be the case. And so it's a very simple fix, right? Little screenshots that you just highlight, click here, click there, do this, or short videos that just show you navigating, and then they can sort of follow along with that as you go. Some people create little YouTube channels that they do that for all their different modules or products. So, and the other thing is, along with that, once I started doing that, those instructions became pretty important to students, but I realized that if I had, so my course is set up as modules, weekly modules, and when they open it up, there's a lot of material that supports the assignments for that week. So it could be instructional videos, it could be papers that they need to read. I made the assumption that they read all that stuff. And in reality, what a lot of students will do is they'll jump straight to the assignment if they know that that's what's going to get the grade. And then they're going to come back to you with questions about, I don't know how to get to this or that, because they haven't actually gone through the material. So if you have students that don't read the textbook for their course, that's analogous to not reading those materials that you put on there to support that assignment. So sort of keep that in mind. So one way there's a couple ways you can solve that. You can just make sure that you highlight this as being an urgent thing, or you can lock the assignment and then it unlocks once they've navigated through all the support materials, depending on what platform you're using. And that'll ensure that you can tell that they've at least opened it, right? So so that was the one thing that I realized I had to do, and it saved myself a lot of headaches and also my students.
Thanks. Erika, how about you? What have you run into trouble-wise, and how have you solved those problems?
So when I first started teaching online, I hadn't really thought through how to establish the community to really foster a space where students felt, I don't want to say obligated, but felt like they couldn't not participate, that they needed to be engaged. And so, you know, as a face-to-face instructor, I spend a lot of time those first week, 2 weeks, developing the environment, developing the sorts of structures that help students feel safe, to talk about how we're going to dialogue, talk about what that's going to be like with them. And I think we make an assumption that if we're online, at least when I was first designing my online courses, I thought, well, of course, people are going to want to engage. They signed up for an online course. Of course, they're going to know that they need to go to the discussion thread and post. And I've clearly stated that's part of my expectation. But in the online environment, we need to spend just as much time developing that community. And what I'm noticing now in this transition from face-to-face to online is that my students, right, they didn't sign up for an online class, and they had a lot of anxiety about that first meeting day. And so like Becca, I'm trying to teach, not teach synchronously, but we have synchronous class meetings and we record them for students who can't join. And the number one thing that students told me in a survey before we went online was that they were really nervous how group work was going to work. And I thought, my goodness, you guys work in groups every day. We do team-based learning. They have the same 4 to 5 students that they've worked with. And we put them into breakout rooms, and that rapport that we had spent so much time developing in the in-class environment really translated well to the online environment. Once they got into the breakout sessions, they were interacting the same way that they normally had. But when we brought them back into the full class, suddenly all interactivity stopped. And so I've had to really think carefully about how to, whether or not that's really important in what I'm doing now. Is it really important that I'm teaching synchronously and we're having a whole class discussion? Maybe not, because where they're getting the real grappling with the content is in their breakout rooms. But I think I've really had to think more carefully about how to develop a space and help students feel compelled to engage in the online environment, both as an online instructor, but now in the transition. And I worry that we're going to be teaching online even in the fall. And so I think that that's going to be a bigger challenge for me to rethink how I establish those groups asynchronously or synchronously online.
So we actually have a couple of questions from the audience related to that as I touch my face. people have asked about how to encourage peers to engage with each other on discussion boards, and I would take that one step further, to not have it be sort of a checkbox exercise, like you must respond to 3 of your peers. So then they just do sort of that response. So if folks have ideas about how to use discussion boards in a way that encourages students to respond to each other and with good quality responses, not just I'm responding because you've asked me to respond.
So Erin, if I could just jump in here with some software that I found to be very helpful, and I'll put it in the chat box here. It's Padlet. And actually, Erika introduced me to Padlet a couple of years ago, and this is the first time I'm using it in my teaching. But it's basically a bulletin board, and students can put sticky notes up on the bulletin board. And so we had students do introductions that way. You can post media links, so you can link to other websites. You can put pictures of yourself. You can do audio clips. And a think, pair, share is really hard to replicate online. But I think that a Padlet brainstorming session is a really nice way to emulate a think, pair, share. It shows everybody's involvement. It shows a diversity of ideas. The way the information is presented on the screen allows the instructor to really quickly scan the information. And it's something that, while I've only used it synchronously so far, it's something that can also unfold over time as people continue contributing to the Padlet. There's also a way to reply or comment on other people's posts, so you can get some interactivity, especially if that's prompted for in a like Andrew was talking about, in some kind of scaffolded way. So you have your initial post, just like you might with a discussion board, but you can see this plethora of ideas, and then at a later time you can return to that Padlet and comment.
Thank you. Other examples of how you might engage students productively in a discussion board?
I think mine will be short because TJ's got way more experience than I do in this. But for me, starting out the semester was one of the things I did was try to help students online see each other as people, not just as electrons. And so some of the first assignments I might do in the fall, I've done this before, but I'm going to try it again, is having students create their own avatars and persona so that they can really get to know one another as people. So those first assignments won't really be about content. They'll be about getting to know one another, find some commonalities, and see each other as people, as well as get used to the interface, because our students are no better at technology than we are, and they need some time to get used to it as well.
Yeah, I would say we have a diverse set of learners, and those that are comfortable with tech. And even if they're comfortable and really fast with their phones, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be really, really comfortable in an online learning platform. So one that I use in both my online and on-ground classes, kind of picking up off the Padlet, is Mentimeter. And I use that because they also have the ability to build word clouds together. They have the ability to kind of put together these rolling sets of ideas depending on what kinds of questions you ask. And you can also do surveys in there, which I think is really helpful depending on your course and what kinds of questions you ask, so that, you know, students can kind of see where the class is at versus where they are. And it can really kind of help with the quote unquote temperature of the class, even if you're asking more affective questions. And I think right now that can be really, really important to kind of just let everybody know that you're thinking of them too. I mean, beyond just the content of the course, right? So you're asking content questions, but then you're also, you know, how's everybody doing? I think that's really important right now to include that, because as Erika was saying, we want them to see each other as people and us as a person as well. And so to kind of include that is really helpful, I think.
So maybe Andy and Jim, can you chime in with other ways of engaging students? People are looking for examples of engagement in an online space.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So one example of a way to do lab activities that help to build community is for one of my courses, we have students test a local water source. And part of the assignment is to describe their local area, the watershed, and take photos that document their testing of their local water source. We use the Lamont low-cost water test kit. And then they provide data to the class on the health of their watershed, the health of the water source. And so when students do that, they share where they're from, their local community, and students say, oh, well, I actually live across town, or I'm originally from there. And it's a very nice community building exercise. And so any kind of activity where students collect local ecological data or some kind of data from their local community can help both with providing an engaging lab activity and in helping build community.
Jim, do you have other ways that you would suggest engaging students in that online space?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the biggest thing has been making sure, so if every week we have some sort of a discussion that goes on in each module, but it's making sure that that the students could be stakeholders in the actual discussion itself. So they a compelling discussion would be one that your students are going to be passionate about. So it could be controversial, so you have to be careful. I do kind of ride the edge a little bit on that, but that gets them in. As an example, because I teach anatomy and physiology, one of the modules is actually on birth control, and that gets the most engagement because these are students, right? And so they probably have some sort of stake in wanting to discuss that. And so whatever your subject matter is just don't assume that if the discussion topic is interesting to you, right, that it's going to be interesting to students. So how do we know that? Well, at the end of the semester, and I'm going to come back to this later, but I'll just use this as an example now. In addition to having the students be able to do their normal, did you like the course? What would you want your instructor to do differently? I have the students suggest discussion topics that they would have liked to have had in the course. And some of those turned out to be pretty good gems in the next time I ran the course. So assuming that we're all going to go back to face-to-face and not have to come back to this, that's not something you have to worry about. But if you get the idea that, this summer I might be teaching online or in the fall or going forward, that's a good way to try to find what the students are interested in. And so that's one of the things that I've been doing that's actually worked pretty well.
We have a number of questions related to breakout groups and how to put people in breakout groups, how long to leave them in breakout groups, how to get sort of logistics as well as sizes of groups. So can the panelists just raise their hands? Who's used breakout groups on a technology? Okay, so tell you what, let's start with Erika, then Jim, then Becca.
So for what it's worth, I've been trying to transition my team-based learning into the online environment. So we are staying synchronous, and that's worked for our class. I have 45 students. And so it's a lot more clunky than it is in real life, as you can imagine. And so they do their team readiness assessment together like they normally would. What I have found problematic with Zoom is that every time I log on, I have to remake these breakout rooms. You can upload a CSV file that has those teams already assigned. That makes it a little bit faster. I do find that my students actually have to be invited as one of my Zoom contacts in order for Zoom to remember that. So it took me a while to figure that out. So when I tell my students to log on, I immediately assign them into their breakout rooms. We have a quick, how you doing? Are we hanging in here together? My students come on and there's a chat prompt, so they're chatting with one another while I'm getting class set up. And then we go into the breakout session for them to work. And so in the breakout session, one of the students is sharing their screen and they're working through their readiness assessment together. And they're in groups of 4 to 5. And in general, in real life, that takes about 10 to 15 minutes. And in Zoom life, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes. What's awkward is that you cannot read the room in the same way. And so you as a facilitator can go into each of the breakout rooms, but you can't peer in and see your whole class at the same time. And so I'm very systematic, and I start with team 1 and I go through all the teams and kind of see how they are. I pop in and out like a genie, and try and figure out when to pull them back in. When I pull them back as a class to do an ED briefing, that has become a little bit more awkward, because we all know that our groups work at different paces in real life, and you can kind of feel a nudge, but in the online environment, it's hard, at least in Zoom. And so what I'm finding is that when I pull groups out together, then there's this feeling of like, I don't want to talk because I don't want those students in the breakout rooms to miss anything, yet there's some valuable instructional time that's kind of being lost. And so what I've tried to do instead is embed a lot more feedback into the tasks that they're completing on Blackboard together as a group. So when they finish the assessment or they finish their team activity, it auto-generates some feedback, and then I have some prompts for them to discuss while they're waiting for the whole class to come together. And that's worked very, very well. And so I tell teams that when you're finished with the discussion questions, then come out. But I'm going to feel free to pull you all out if I feel like everybody's at that stage, because I can look on Blackboard and see who's completed their assessments. And if I see that they've all done their team readiness assessment or their team activity, great, I'm going to pull them all out of breakout rooms and put them into class. So that's how I've handled it. They're only in breakouts for about 10 to 15 minutes, but that's all they would have been in class anyway. We rinse and repeat 10, 15 minutes in group, then all together, then 10, 15 minutes in a group.
Jim, how about you? How do you use breakout groups?
Well, so I'm probably just gonna add on to something that you might think about, whether you're doing breakout groups or if you're trying to create groups in Blackboard, like working groups, any sort of group activity where you're not inserting yourself regularly. One of the recommendations I would have is just sort of set up some, like if you went to a meeting, you get these meeting norms, right? Sort of rules of engagement. You don't assume that your students understand what that means, and they might actually have a different idea about how to interact with other people based on what they're used to with social media and things. So, try to make sure whatever you're doing, whether it's breakouts, like I said, or small group work. I have students work in small groups on projects throughout the semester, but I still have to set up those norms, because before I did that, I used to get complaints from students that someone was dominating or someone was nasty, or a lot of times they can't read body language, and it's just their head, or maybe not even, maybe it's just through text. So I use them in ways that a lot of people use them, but I just would recommend that people think about making sure that the students understand what those rules are in whatever group setup that you have, or breakouts. Yeah.
Becca, do you have thoughts to add about the group management? And we have a couple questions related to equity of group work and how to grade equitably, how to encourage equitable participation.
I would just add that instead of having groups that are persisting throughout the term, our groups are short for in-class discussion on a particular topic. So for example, this week being the first week of the quarter, we had what we call a gallery walk on the syllabus. So there were different questions about the syllabus at different stations, and different teams of students worked on answering each question. And then they rotated through all of the stations. So we just broke the class into groups randomly, into chunks of about 5, and they went through station by station. And the other part of this is then what technology were we using to record their ideas? And we did a combination of shared Google Docs, where in one class we had one Google Doc with all of the questions in it, and students rotated which question they were on. In another class, we actually had a separate Google Doc for each station. And that actually was neat because we could give each group a different color and font. So we could see how the ideas were changing over time more easily than in the single Google Doc. And then we also used Padlet, where we had a column in the bulletin board in each column had a different question in it, and the students rotated across the different columns through time. So I just mentioned that as another way to use group work in the online setting.
TJ, I saw you nod when I asked the question about sort of equitable contributions, equitable grading, equitable participation. So maybe you could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I find rubrics really, really helpful. Designing them before you actually deliver the assessment, whether it's formative or summative to students, so that you have a clear idea in your head of what it is that you're going to be measuring, but then also delivering to students at the same time you deliver the assessment. So what we would normally do in terms of maybe verbal or, showing them on a PowerPoint or something, those directions, I think being very explicit, maybe overly explicit in an online platform is really helpful because they can keep going back to it. And then, as was mentioned earlier, it makes your on-ground practice better because oftentimes you're taking that practice back to your classroom. So 2 things about rubrics is you can build into your rubric, depending on how much weight you want to give it, that students are interacting with each other. And what does that look like? And so many times in my online classes, I give examples of what good contributions to the classroom discussion would look like, because in a social media world, a like is an interaction, but that's not what we're looking for, that they just like each other's stuff or say, good job, that was awesome. We want it to be more substantive than that. So what does that look like for them? Being very clear in that, and then having that reflected in the rubric. And the second part of the rubric is if you are able to, depending on your LMS, grade anonymously. So you're equitably grading everyone the same, and then you can go back later and see how individual students did. But I find it really helpful to grade, for example, if I'm doing individual questions, grade one question all at once, grade the second question all at once. So I'm grading them all the same, and then you just don't get those same kinds of questions about, well, they got a half point more than I did, or whatever it may be. That you've set your rubric, you've been able to grade anonymously, and it's as close to equitable as you possibly can be. Yeah, so that's typically how I've arranged it.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions related to technology, and there's lots of different technologies being mentioned, which I'm writing down some of them very quickly. Andy, how do you make choices about which technologies to use, how many technologies to use, especially we've got this sort of in the moment transition, and then also people who are planning maybe for summer or for fall. Do you have a sense of how you navigated choosing technologies and choosing how many technologies over time?
Yeah, that's a good question, because one of the other things that I found when I first launched my online series was students complained that it was too hard to find. There was they had to go to a different website and create a separate login for a different website. They had to, they had to go to different places to do things. I had an online textbook they had to go to and do work there, and then I transferred grades to Canvas, and I had another a peer review software that they would use that was also off of the LMS, and I had to transfer grades from. Basically, I've tried to figure out ways to integrate those things as best as possible. Right now, I favor things that are integrated with Canvas, which is our LMS, so students can go directly to the site from Canvas and don't have to go separately. That wasn't always possible, but when I'm considering technology that I'm going to use, I favor things that can be deeply integrated into my LMS over other things. I think that was it also saves time for the instructor too if grades automatically transfer. Because yes, that's a problem. When I first launched my course, I had 4 different places that students would go complete work. And I wanted to try to replicate my on-campus course as best I could. So I thought that was absolutely necessary. And I found that, again, in the interest of reducing complexity and making things easier for students and increasing student success, I've had to scale back a little bit.
So related to that, how have you all made the choice about how much to be synchronous versus asynchronous? And have you changed that choice over time or in particular situations? Go ahead, TJ.
So all of mine have always been asynchronous. At a community college, my student schedules are all over the place right now. Most of my students, if they weren't laid off, they've actually picked up extra hours. So they are the ones on the front lines working grocery stores and, the kinds of service that are still running right now. And so they're not able to be online with me. I've always done my online classes asynchronously for many of those same reasons, because either I have students from all over the country or over the world taking the class, and it's just not possible if somebody's in the military, in the Middle East, to be able to sign into the class at the same time. So when I switched over a couple of weeks ago, I just adopted that same model, mostly because I think it was easier for me, but also I didn't want to stress students too much by asking them to try and switch work schedules or something, like if they were able to pick up some extra time. So for me, that's just the way that I've been doing it, but I'm very comfortable with an asynchronous model. I know that for many, synchronous works really well, and that is great. I'm in a PhD program where it is synchronous online, and so 20 of us get together, and it works out really well that way. But that's just my personal way of doing it. And I'm just, as Andrew said, just very clear on due dates. I use our calendar function exclusively. I'm constantly messaging students about this is coming up. Don't forget, if you need an extension because of something going on, please let me know. We'll talk about it. So I think it's that conversation piece. If you're not doing synchronous, that's really important, to keep reaching out to students constantly and letting them know, we're still here. You may not have checked in for a few days, but we're still here.
How about folks who've used a little bit more synchronous? What sort of made it okay for you to use a little bit more synchronous, and how do you make that work?
I'll jump in. Oh, sorry.
Maybe first Andy and then Erika, how about?
Sure. So my approach has been to scale back the synchronous part, to build in both asynchronous and synchronous. And so I may do a voiceover lecture that's 15 minutes and then have what's often referred to as a recitation, basically a shorter discussion where students can ask questions. They're expected to watch the lecture and they can ask live questions in a synchronous session that isn't as long as a normal lecture. It's recorded, so it's available then to students that can't come in synchronously. But I found that combining those works for me.
How about you, Erika? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's the same. I was going to say the same thing as Andrew, and except that I'm terrified of doing a mini lecture online. I don't know. I mean, like, I don't, like, this bothers me, seeing my face on a screen. This really bothers me. And so the anxiety that I feel if I have to record a mini lecture is, like, honestly almost a barrier to my well-being. And what I realized was that there are so many other faculty who have put together really great mini lectures on the exact same content I teach, that all I had to do was send an email out to the community and say, hey, what do you got? And everyone sent me their YouTube channels. And so, now I really can put little 20-minute snippets there. We can watch it. They can put questions to me and I can answer them the same way. I only say that because I think I'm not the only faculty member who is scared to death of recording themselves. So you don't have to. Other people have done it and they've done a great job.
So that's actually related to another question that's come up from the conversation is, how much of your own content do you develop versus using existing tools or content? And I would say that both related to quote unquote lecture classes and lab classes. So maybe Jim, can you jump in there on that one? And then maybe
Yeah, I
also,
mean, obviously,
Becca, since you both have come at this from sort of different timelines.
obviously it's a huge savings of your time if you can find stuff that meets your needs. I think for most of the instructors that I've worked with, even if you're grabbing something, if it's not a YouTube video, obviously, but if you're grabbing something that's content related, that people want to adapt it in some ways to sort of fit the need that they're looking for. So I choose to, because anatomy and physiology, for example, the course that I'm teaching is so content heavy, creating my own materials really is kind of a challenge. I happen to like to teach with the use of case studies, and there's a National Center for Case Study Teaching in Buffalo that has a huge library of case studies, not just in anatomy and physiology, but in lots of topics. And so I tend to go towards products like that. The other nice thing about that is that if you find something that you're grabbing that you're not creating, if you can use a lot of it, it helps your students because they get used to it. So with my case studies, they know what those are after week 2. And so I'm using that same material that I've grabbed from that source throughout the entire course, and they just get comfortable with it. So one of the things I wouldn't recommend is if you're grabbing a lot of material that you're not creating yourself, is trying to get it from 500 different sources and have it look all very differently to your students, because that'll make them a little uncomfortable in reality. The other thing I was going to add about the synchronous part is I have heard from some people that trying to do, for instance, a synchronous course through Zoom or some other online platform during the middle of the day can be tricky in terms of bandwidth for some students, because that's when a lot of people are on meetings. So then I said, well, I was thinking, well, isn't that always the middle of the day somewhere in the world that people are using the Zoom technology? But one of the recommendations was, if you're doing something synchronous, do it start your synchronous meeting on the quarter of the hour, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea, because nobody starts a meeting at 12:15, right? They always start it at noon. So if you're hearing students having issues with bandwidth and you just need to get on with them for 10 minutes for like an office visit, maybe don't do it at the top of the hour if you're having issues with that. That's something that I haven't checked that yet, so don't hold me to that that's actually true. But I thought it was a good suggestion.
TJ, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, my space bar is not working now all of a sudden. Yeah, and actually I've been holding office hours at 9 o'clock at night for the same reasons that Jim just mentioned. I was trying to hold them during the day, and it was just students, and there's just not a lot of luck. I'm in a very rural area, so our internet is not great on normal. So doing it and then is a lot better, because half of the areas that I'm I'll be on watching TV, but not so much using Zoom. So
yeah, thank you. Becca, how about you thinking about your content, especially since you're moving from a hybrid environment to that fully online environment? How are you dealing with content development?
Yeah, so my some of my courses are content-based and some are skills-based. So the skills-based courses, I've been developing that content for years. So it's really thinking about how what are the connections across the face-to-face instruction and the online instruction. And the more experience I have in the online world, the more convergence there is between those two approaches. And so it can be fairly straightforward to move stuff online. I teach the skills-based courses like workshops. So it's how do I facilitate a workshop in a Zoom environment instead of a face-to-face environment. Now, again, that's synchronous. And there are problems with synchronous instruction. But I find that one of the challenges in hybrid instruction, and one of the challenges I'm thinking of right now for online instruction for students who didn't sign up for these courses, is the accountability that comes with regular meetings. So even if the scheduled class time is held like office hours, it's still this regular check-in moment that can help people who need that commitment to others. to complete their coursework. And I'll say that's how I am with my writing. When I'm writing, if I have regular meetings with my collaborators, that's what's keeping me going. Because if I tell myself, oh, I'm going to write for myself at this moment, then other things come up and swamp that. So, right. So how do we provide that kind of accountability for students? Now, the content-based courses that I'm teaching are seminars, and the topics are rotating, and they're really specific. So unlike Jim, where he's working with A&P and there's lots of material available, he can choose from that resources, but we're really working in teams to develop seminars with new content on primary literature. So it, you know, it's just part of the nature of that course to be coming up with new content every time we teach it.
So we do have at least one question, and I'm sure more lurking in the background about Zoom bombing. If folks are not familiar, TJ, I know we're doing some reading on it. Can you comment on what Zoom bombing is and what we can do about it?
So Becca actually put in a great link in the chat from, it's USC, I think? Yeah. That has a bunch of different resources to be able to deal with Zoom bombing if you happen to come across it. I've been very lucky myself and not had issues with it. But basically it's where Zoom gets hacked, and any number of things can happen when you're hosting a Zoom meeting, many of which you don't want to happen during your Zoom meeting. But what I was reading yesterday, and there's any number of different articles out about it right now, but especially in the tech space, they've been talking about how Zoom is very aware of this. They are right now diverting their R&D funds to patch the security flaws, because really much of the corporate and educational world is using Zoom right now. And obviously it looks bad for them to have this happening. So they are fixing the problems as quickly as they can. I am not a spokesperson for Zoom by any means whatsoever. I'm just telling you guys what I found. But hopefully they'll have it resolved very quickly, because the problems that have been happening have not been very good. In the meantime, the link that Becca shared are some workarounds that you can do, including settings on the back end, whether you have a free or a paid account, to be able to kind of hold the line as much as possible from having somebody take over your account or get into the break rooms or steal the chat function or whatever it is that they're in there trying to do. So.
Thank you. So Andrew, you mentioned the idea of sort of short lectures. Is that right? You do sort of short recorded lectures. We have a question from the community that at least at one university in Puerto Rico, or at least one set of classes in Puerto Rico, that the lectures are entirely synchronized. And so they're wondering about, you know, is that sufficient? Do you just make that then available through a learning management system, or how do you successfully engage students who aren't able to be there synchronously? Maybe you have ideas about that.
Yeah, I think having a mixed approach where you have where you can focus on doing a voiceover that to Erika, who doesn't like to, you know, video her face while she's teaching, just do a voiceover. You know, you could still trip up, but I think it's, at least for me, it's a lot easier to do. I think having a combination of that with synchronous sessions, because synchronous sessions allow students to ask questions, you know, as they come up with them. It helps to build community, but it isn't the main content driving component of the course then, because what I've seen is that some of these synchronous Zoom lectures can get kind of chaotic because of some of the things that have happened and people not knowing, you know, how to use the program, you know, perfectly. I found that I think it's effective to have a combination of the two. And so I would encourage, if it's possible, to do a voiceover or a a short lecture, maybe 15 minutes, or some of the main concepts that you really want to get across, and you can just do it, and focus on it. And then if students have questions, then they can do that synchronously. I found that to be relatively effective.
Thank you. I'm glad that those ideas are useful. Share them with your colleagues. And we are recording this webinar, and we'll post it on the ASCD site, along with the transcript of the chat and the Q&A, so that those resources will not be lost. Tell you what, we're going to ask one more sort of logistical question, and then we're going to get to the broader question of how we build community, especially in a pretty tough social climate that we're all dealing with, the stress of a global pandemic. But before we get there, we have one last question that's more logistical in nature: how to handle group presentations online. So is anyone doing group presentations, and how are you navigating that? Anyway, I'll have the panelists. Anyone doing that at all? Becca, you want to take that then?
Sure. This actually builds off what Andrew was just talking about, so it's a nice transition. What we'll do is break our students into small groups, and then each student has prepared a slideshow with a voiceover. So this is actually an asynchronous activity. So in a group of about 5 students, each student needs to watch each other's presentation, and then they answer some questions about it. Often these are mini research proposals, and so one of the questions we ask is, why would you fund this? And then another question we ask is, what additional information do you want to determine whether you would fund this? So it's a twist on how to ask what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses. And then, so that's set up in the discussion board in the learning management system, the LMS. And then the authors can go back and respond to the questions that their peers wrote.
Nice, thank you. Anyone else use group online presentations or class presentations?
My colleague does this, and she's always done it in her face-to-face. But what she did, instead of actually having them do the group presentation live, she would have them record either a voiceover or record them giving a presentation, and then she has a class YouTube channel that the students post their videos to. And the assignment is that they're giving a public service announcement about something related to the content. And so she's still doing that, right? The students can still kind of create these things together and post them. And then they do something similar to what Becca suggests. There's an asynchronous component where they have some guided questions to provide feedback or to pose questions of the folks. But so I think it works well asynchronously. I have a colleague who's doing it synchronously in Zoom for senior capstone course, and the way that they've amended that is to just break their class into smaller groups. So rather than have all 45 students presenting, they have them, there's a day that there's a subgroup of them who meet to do a presentation and provide critique in real time.
Nice, thank you. Since we only have a few more minutes, I want to end by really asking you all questions that I've been struggling with about how to build community. Now, I already have met my students. I know them. I've been interacting with them, and I miss them. Teaching for me and learning is a social endeavor, and so I'm really struggling with being tired from teaching online, not getting the same rush I get out of teaching in person. And I also, I don't even want to think about what it's going to be like to teach without ever having met my students in person, especially at a time when we all are stressed with our personal situations, with illness, more and more, more or less prevalence in different parts of the country. So how are you all thinking about building community, giving your students a safe space, making sure that folks are kind to one another, and that we're kind to ourselves, because we're all struggling with the ups and downs and the new challenges that we're facing every day professionally. So maybe each of you could close with a comment on that, and then we'll wrap up.
Let me go first.
Sure, go ahead, Jim, and then Becca.
So yeah, so I'm the example of somebody who jumps into a semester not having met the students at all, right? So this is totally asynchronous. I never see them face to face. And it's a massive challenge to even consider what it's going to be like to try to create community. But if you were on the first webinar that we did, I'm going to go back to the same suggestion, is that I try to make sure that I communicate with students as if they're sitting right in front of me. And even though they're not, right? So not treat it as if they send me a note that doesn't require a response, to not respond. I respond to every single, and it takes a long time, but even if they just say, hey, I found it, but thanks for your help because you helped them with something, I'll respond back and say, no problem, that's what I'm here for. So just think about if your student is communicating you in any way, how would you respond if they were doing it standing right in front of you? And respond that way with the technology, because that's really important for developing that rapport with your students.
Thank you. Becca, how about you?
I think it's really important to make sure that students understand how flexible the class can be right now, and that all classes need to be flexible. I expect, this is an assumption that I'm making, that our students think that they're invincible, that they won't get sick. And I suspect that once they start getting sick, it's going to come as a shock. And when their loved ones are getting sick, it's also going to come as a shock, and it's going to be a huge burden. So I'm anticipating the opportunity to work with them and meet them where they are. What I notice already is that students are continually asking the same questions about logistics. So again, first week of the quarter, we can say, oh, you can participate in the class asynchronously if you want, and also using different terminology so it's not falling into jargon. Oh, you can make up the materials on your own time if that works better for you, but they're still not getting that. And I think in normal times they would get that, but right now they're just so, there's so much emotional weight that they're carrying, so much anxiety, that simple messages aren't getting communicated. So I think we also need just extra patience with that, and with ourselves as well, because, you know, it's easy to categorize this as a challenge for our students and find empathy for them, but we also need that empathy for ourselves because of the emotional toll that's affecting us as well.
Andrew, any closing thoughts related to that?
Sure, I would say encourage your students to provide feedback on their experience. I've used surveys. In Canvas, you can do ungraded surveys that students can provide feedback on a week or on particular assignments, and just encourage them to reach out to you in both formal ways like that and also informal ways. And I've found that one of the biggest surprises for me is that the rapport that I could build with my students that I never met in person in my online classes. So once you get to know a little bit more about students and they're comfortable sharing things with you, you can develop pretty good rapport and develop a connection with students. And some really rewarding things that have happened to me is I have students, you know, they go on to get a degree in a grad school and they send me the t-shirt of the school that they went to. Or Oregon State has an in-person option for online students for graduation, so they can come and walk in person when they graduate, and then I finally get to meet them in person, and I know them way better in many cases than I do my on-campus students.
All right, Erika and TJ, 30 seconds each. Sorry, I'm giving you a short shrift here.
That's okay. So one is I use the Remind app, which has been really popular in K-12 schools, but I've started using it recently, kind of connect with students, and also switching my assignments to actually have a reflective piece that kind of connects the material to what's going on.
I've been using the performance dashboard in my LMS so that I can see how frequently my students are accessing things and see if there's a pattern in them not being able to access. So it could be that they can't access, or it could be that there's some motivation or something else is happening. And so I can very quickly look across students and then send a personalized email to them to reach out.
That's nice to keep that personal connection. So thank you so much, panelists, for sharing your expertise, your experience, your troubleshooting, and thanks for all the great questions. Hopefully everyone will find a little bit of time to rest and relax and recharge this weekend. And most of all, we're sending you good wishes for health and well-being. Thanks again. Take care.